Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we are continuing a two-part series. This is part 2 of a two-part series around the 3 styles of cognitive function loops. Now, if you're a brand new listener, that might be pretty intimidating when you hear that title because it's like, what in the world are you cognitive function? I don't even know what you're talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the best thing you could possibly do right now is go over to personalityhacker.com and look up cognitive functions and something else that we call the CAR model. This is going to give you a lot of information and some reference points to continue on this discussion. But just for the sake of going along, if you don't want to go do that research right now and you'd like to listen, when we talk about cognitive functions, we're talking about mental processes in your brain wiring, basically, that show up and help you make decisions and help you learn or perceive new information in the world. And when we talk about a cognitive function loop, we're talking about in our CAR model example here at Personality Hacker, when your dominant mental process or cognitive function gets into cahoots with your tertiary, what's technically called your tertiary or 10-year-old function, they begin to form a loop that can sometimes give you challenges in life. And so that's what we're talking about here. And if you haven't heard part 1, we go into more detail around the principles of the loop in the last podcast in part 1, so you can get a frame of reference. This is really going to build upon the body of knowledge we started working on in that podcast. We're going to continue on in this podcast. In the last podcast, we talked about all the IP personality types. So INFP, ISFP, INTP, and ISTPs. And we also talked about all the EJ personality types, ENFJ, ENTJ, ESFJ, ESTJ. In this podcast, we're going to cover the EPs and the IJs. So we're going to cover the ENFPs, ESFPs, ENTPs, ESTPs, and we're going to cover the IJs, INFJ, ISFJ, INTJ, and ISTJ. I know that seems like a mouthful for me to recite. Tony's laughing at me because I just ran down the list of all the types. But if you're new to this, I want to give you a frame of reference so you're not like, IJs, what are they talking about? That's all.
Yeah. Well, and
why are you laughing? Is that why you're laughing? Because I'm listing out all this?
Yeah, I didn't expect you to go through all 16 types. But I mean, to help you in your pattern recognition, the reason why we've clumped these particular types together is that in the last podcast, on the first one of this 2-part series, we talked about all 4 of the perceiving functions as 10-year-old or tertiary processes and how they end up getting into an echo chamber with the driver or the dominant. And now we're going to talk about the 4 judging functions or decision-making processes that can get into an echo chamber cahoot situation with the driver or the dominant. And so we're going to talk about all the EPs and all the IJs who have a judging function as their 10-year-old or tertiary process.
And we'll cluster these together. So first, let's just talk about, again, we're continuing from last week, so we're not going to go through all the basics. Go back and listen to that. Let's jump right into the EPs right now. And let's first talk about the ENFPs and the ESFPs, because they're going to share a cognitive function at the 10-year-old or tertiary level of extroverted thinking. That's the technical name. We've nicknamed it here effectiveness. Effectiveness, when it is a strength in someone's personality, it shows up basically getting things accomplished in the outer world, managing timelines, project management, accomplishing tasks, extroverted thinking about things in the outer world and how they're accomplished through a linear structure. So A, B, C, D, you add all those together, you get a task that's accomplished basically in the outer world.
And at its core, so all the judging functions, what they're intended to do is they're intended to evaluate. That's their purpose. When we pick up information in the outside world, we also have to make decisions on what that information means to us. And we all choose a different way of evaluating it or determining its importance. And I'd like to call it the shouldness of something. Like, what should we be doing? And we make those should statements based on our evaluations. What's important, what we prioritize, what means something to us. And if you're an EP, that means that your Copilot and your 10-year-old are going to be where you pull on all of these should statements, because your driver or dominant process is a perceiving process. It means it's taking in information and simply soaking it in and observing and trying to make sense of the world. So for all of the types, when we get into a loop, and we talked about this in the first podcast, when we get into a loop situation, it means that we're avoiding our Copilot process and the evaluation that the Copilot is coming up with. And we do that because it's evaluating in a world that we're less familiar with, right? Because your dominant or your driver process is going to be either introverted or extroverted, and your Copilot's going to be the opposite of that. It's going to take a different attitude. It's going to explore a different world. But your 10-year-old goes back to being in the same attitude or world as your driver, your dominant, which is why it creates an echo chamber situation, a supportive, defensive, stance. And with each of these loops, we're going to talk about what the type is ultimately attempting to avoid. And so for ESFPs and ENFPs that both use effectiveness as a 10-year-old process, what they're trying to avoid is the Copilot of introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And one of the reasons why they're avoiding that is because introverted feeling or authenticity is incredibly subjective. It's a subjective position that allows the person to evaluate based on what's meaningful to them, like what strikes them, what makes them feel a certain way, what resonates and is authentic for them, what feels in alignment with who they are. And that takes a lot of calibration. It takes a lot of calibration over a long timeline. And if you are insecure about your assessments, if you don't feel like you're qualified to make those evaluations, or you haven't developed that process sufficiently, then you can get really insecure about what it's spitting out. Like, well, this doesn't feel right. Well, how am I supposed to rely on what feels right and what doesn't feel right? Like, that's not a very good metric. And so to avoid that feeling of insecurity or indecision, or having to sit with something for a really long time to determine whether or not it's striking you the way it needs to, then both EFP types, ENFPs and ESFPs, will skip the Copilot and then go to the 10-year-old of effectiveness. Because effectiveness has outer world metrics. It's got metrics that not only can be, actually measured with measurements, different resource measurements like money or time or impact or something to that effect, but also you're getting other people's real world feedback on whether or not you did a good job. So as opposed to having to rest into your own self-evaluation, you just kind of hand that over to other people. And also, not only can you hand it over to others, but you can actually see the impact. You can personally witness it. So each of these loops is a desire to avoid a ever-shifting evaluation, personal evaluation that is very difficult to sort of land on, and then instead favor outer world feedback, the impact you're seeing or the feedback you're getting from other people to make your ultimate calls. And unfortunately, that's not good for EFPs because they need something of subjectivity because they start out with an extroverted process. So they need something that's an introverted process. So each of these loops that we talk about, you're going to see that manifest, that avoidance of what feels like an insecure place in an attempt to have something more concrete.
Yeah, and so we, in the last episode, talked about how we break these loops up. We talk about 3 levels of looping. So there's the first level. It's a very short term. It's immediate. It's in the moment. It's almost like an explosive expression of something. It can often be very defensive or momentary to get something accomplished. Then there's a mid-grade, more strategy level of loop, which is something that is pulled upon, not in the moment, but more in a season or in a time period that's needed. So it's almost like a tool or a strategy that's pulled on. More conscious, just like, I would say in the moment sometimes is unconscious. This strategy is probably more conscious. It's a little bit more, we have more awareness of it, and we're using it over, it could be several weeks, could be several months, it could be just a very short period of time, but it is a strategy we're pulling upon. And then the third style is more of a lifestyle. It's something that we may not be very conscious of. It's something that's integrated into our psyche. It's something that we do a low-grade level, low-grade meaning that we're not aware of it. It's subterranean. It's something we might be looping in perpetually throughout our entire life. So we know that the loop comes, we've identified the loop seems to express itself in one or more of these different levels in how it loops. For the EFPs, so ESFPs and ENFPs, there's a different driver function that each of these are going to use. So ESFPs are going to use the driver function in their car, their primary cognitive function of technically called extroverted sensing. We've nicknamed it sensation. It's all about the here and now. It's about your body and physicality. It's about watching people's body language. It's about being in the moment, reaction, responsive. It's very real time. It's about all the senses, the five senses and all the senses of motion and touch and temperature and these things. And it's very aware kinesthetically about its environment. Whereas ENFPs use a extroverted process, technically called extroverted intuition. It's an intuitive learning style or perceiving process. We've nicknamed it exploration. And it's about messing with the environment in the real world to find disparate connections between seemingly unconnected things. So exploration is all about, trying to find the patterns in the outer world and develop an intuitive sense about what's going on from the patterns that they're perceiving and the connections and the what-if questions they're asking. So that's the ENFP. So this loop's going to show up in a little bit of a different flavor. So we have 3 different levels, and then we're going to apply that to the ENFP and the ESFP in the flavor that they show up with based on the cognitive function they're leading with.
Yeah, even though they've got a different driver, their loops show up pretty similar, though.
Yeah.
Because they're both they're both letting the outside world give them the information they're looking for. So whether they're looking for the streamlined action that sensation is looking for, or whether they're looking for a hidden pattern that exploration is looking for, their loop actually shows up quite similar. And one note I wanted to make on that second style, when you talked about strategy, you said it could last for up to a couple weeks. We talked about this in the last podcast. It's like a tool you pull off the shelf. It actually can last your entire life. It's not something that you're using like extended, like the same, you can do that. You can use that same strategy day in, day out. But it's more like it's one of the tools you pull from your tool belt. And I just wanted to make that clarification so that a person who is trying to self-identify what loops they're in might be able to see when they pull that strategy off the shelf, because it can be one of your go-to strategies your whole life.
Yeah, one of my examples that I would say is the strategy, because I am an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, would be the emotion of anxiety. I use it to help motivate me. When I'm in a loop and I need to get something accomplished in the outer world, I tend to create a ton of to-do items using that effectiveness process and create a sense of all this pressure on a to-do list to create anxiety in me. And then I get myself into action, and it's a strategy I can pull upon, and I'm looping there. I'm just in this loop of getting stuff done and an anxiety and feeling like I've got to get this to-do list checked off. And that's what I can use to motivate me as a strategy. And I know that I'm doing it. I watch when it happens, and I have to get a hold of that.
So let's talk about that in the second one. Let's go to the first one
Sure.
first. Okay. Because I've got one too. I've got a recent example of my loop, which we'll be talking about in just a moment. So the first style of loop is that sort of explosive, in the moment, everybody can observe it. It's very obvious to everybody else form of loop. And that is forcefulness, like an aggressive stance. And I've even seen some EFPs look crazy on purpose because they want whatever is the thing they're avoiding. And of course, for EFPs, it's a personal evaluation. It's a very, it's an unsure of their subjective self-evaluation. So they're trying to avoid actual personal feelings. And whatever the outside world has done to remind them of this personal evaluation that they don't feel good about, they're trying to get rid of that, whatever triggered that. They're trying to get rid of the trigger as fast as possible. So they'll go into an explosive stance. It could look like punching walls. It can look like a verbal attack. It can look like craziness. It's just a forceful, aggressive position to try to make an absolutely in-the-moment impact as fast as possible. I would say it's one of the most obvious of all of the loops is this aggressive stance. And ETPs have one that's really similar too, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's trying to force the outside world to bend to your will in some way.
Usually it's focused on something physical. I could be focused on people, but only as much as people are a resource that aren't performing in the way you want them to. So it can be personal, but often it is, like you said, and when we contrast this with ETPs, you're going to see the difference here. This is much more like, it's much more likely, instead of yelling at somebody, it could be yelling at somebody, but it's more likely to punch a wall or punch your keyboard because something's not functioning, or like it's a messing with the environment, trying to force something structurally to change and even break it if needed in order to get an effect in the world.
Yeah, I would say that people, because extroverted thinking or effectiveness can depersonalize, it can kind of dehumanize others because it sees them as resources. When you're in a loop, that's entirely what people become. I would say as EFPs, people are not people anymore. They're resources, and they're either good resources or bad resources. They're either doing what you want them to do or they're not. And so it's actually a very depersonalized stance. And the reason why is because you're running away from the thing that would personalize them. You're running away from introverted feeling or authenticity, the Copilot. That is a process that can't help but personalize everything and see everybody as their own unique subjective expression of humanity. But you're getting away from that. You're trying to go to a place where you're depersonalizing everybody. So it is a very impersonal place, but it also happens to be a very aggressive one because it wants to see immediate return, even if that immediate return is destruction.
And it could be hurting somebody's feelings or being destructive toward people. So I just had this recently happen to me in the last few days. We were driving with our kids on a long trip, our 3 children, and you were trying to look up something for my oldest son, Gunnar, on my computer sitting next to me as I'm driving. And I can't get in there and mess with it. I can't get in there and actually be in the account and look this thing up, right? And you're looking up this information kind of vicariously through my instructions. I'm saying, hey, can look this up, and I'm getting frustrated because I'm not in control of it. And so it's not working the way I want to. And then you end up on was trying to log into one of Gunnar's email accounts, and you land on this one email. You're like, oh, is this the email here? I'm like, no. And I explode at you. And in the moment, this is when I got into a loop, an explosive loop. I said, no, that's not the email. That's the one I'm going to give him when he turns 18. I have that email. I'm emailing him letters from his dad. And I explode on you purposely to make you feel bad in the moment to get the effect that I want. So I'm blasting a bunch of energy, exploding on you about this. And you're like, oh, and then Gunnar's upset because, I basically revealed some secret that I've got. It wasn't that big a deal. We talked it through, but it was like this big explosion in the moment to force something to make you feel bad about an action because I was frustrated.
Well, in a situation like that, even though you might be dehumanizing the person, you still know exactly what to say to hit them to their core.
Yeah.
So it might look actually quite personal, but it's not in a weird way. It's, what to say to hurt the person to get them to behave the way you want them to behave.
Yeah.
And I think all of us have these moments when we have an explosive loop. Let's go to the second one. And that was the one that you were hinting at before. This is more that strategy you can pull off the shelf and use whenever you need to use it. For EFPs, this can just basically be busyness. Now, you have an association with anxiety you just mentioned, and the anxiety is what gets you into the busyness. But really, it could be attached to any emotion, or maybe even feels emotionless. But it's just this constant, can't slow down, can't check in, constant busyness. And the reason why this is a strategy is when you're busy, you're too busy to sit and think. And so if you're avoiding something inside of you that feels like it's going to need some real work and time to address, like a real there be dragons scenario, then constant busyness is helpful because then you just never have to slow down. And most people will reward busyness. You mentioned that you get into an emotion of anxiety, and that's what keeps you going. Like if you're anxious, then you have to keep working. And that's also it's an avoidant place. Because a single emotion completely overwhelms you, and then you can't get into all of the more fine-grained emotions and really, reflect on what's going on for you. But regardless of what it looks like in the specific, the strategy itself is to just stay busy and constantly be in motion.
Yeah, I think for EFPs, ESFPs, and ENFPs, the 10-year-old of effectiveness likes to find supportive emotions from their introverted feeling or authenticity process to help support the activity they're doing. And so almost it's like your 10-year-old should be in service of your Copilot, but EFPs tend to reverse it in this particular instance with emotion, using those emotions to help augment or support what they're doing in the external world, this looping. So I'm using those emotions, I'm pulling upon them to serve not a really good space for me to be in as an EFP. And so if you're an EFP listening, you might resonate with this. You're using emotions to support that busyness. You're finding reasons in your emotional states, like maybe anxiety or anger or whatever else, to keep yourself pushing and motivated and pushing forward.
Yeah. And so the third style of loop is, again, more integrated into the day-to-day lifestyle. And these are very difficult to call out. Like the first couple styles, the first one in particular is super obvious to everybody else. And then people go, it's unacceptable for you to behave like that. And you go, okay, I won't do that anymore. But the second and the third, the strategy, and in particular, the integrated loop, which is more, we've talked about it being more subterranean. It's very difficult for other people to call you on it because they might not even be seeing it, which is why I always feel like these third styles of loops are probably the most insidious. And for EFPs, this is, again, that uncertainty of their own personal self-evaluation. They're not sure how they should be feeling about themselves because they haven't taken the time to really cultivate that introverted feeling or authenticity process. And maybe they've been going to their strategy of busyness too much, or regardless of what the situation is. What ends up manifesting is almost like a full-scale outsourcing of their self-esteem and of their beliefs and values, because they're not really sure how they should be feeling about themselves. And so I would say even more so the self-esteem gets outsourced. And what ends up happening is they stop living for themselves. They start living for whatever is the praise. I mean, praise is one metric you can use, but you could also use maybe resource building, like they're making a lot of money, or people really like them, or they've got a lot of social capital, or whatever it is, whatever is the outside metric, that becomes like their self-esteem becomes attached to that. And so they're doing really well for themselves and they get a lot of praise for it, and people are giving them a lot of positive feedback. And that's maybe one of the reasons why it's so insidious, is that it's hard for an EFP in this situation to slow down enough and go, yeah, but what do I think about myself? And so it ends up becoming a very hollow existence. Nobody really knows them. They don't really even know themselves.
We talked about in the last episode this idea of noble pursuits or noble activities. And if you are accomplishing things in the outer world, you're an EFP, you're getting stuff done, you're accomplishing things in the outer world, there are metrics happening, your bank account is filling up, people seem to be happy with you because you're performing well. What feedback are you getting that's saying what you're doing is not noble? In fact, you're getting a message like what you're doing is noble. You're keeping things running. You're doing a great job. Look at all the accomplishment. Look at all the resource you're getting, or the things in the outer world you're getting for this. And it's this idea of noble pursuits. You are the only one that's going to be able to probably spot this at a deep level and catch it, because the outer world's going to tell you you're on the right track. This is noble to be pursuing this.
Was that noble distractions?
Yeah, it's basically noble distractions, noble pursuits, noble things that no one in the outer world is going to say that's not what you should be doing, because it looks to the outer observer you're absolutely on the right path.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you're in one of these loops, it's tough to even recognize it yourself. And the only way you'll know is because the result will not be what you want. It won't be satisfaction or self-satisfaction or self-esteem. An EFP can't do enough to fill the void inside. And that's how you know you're in this third loop. And the only thing that you can do is go back to self-evaluation. As difficult as that might be, because if you've been building an entire life around this and then you go to self-evaluation, you get to a point where you go, oh, I'm living a hollow lie. That's not good. And then you have a lot of work to do. So those are the three loops. I'm realizing we're probably going a little deeper than we went last time. We should probably, these are our loops.
Yeah.
So we'll probably be like, we'll spend all this time on EPs because like, this is me, this is my loop. So let's go to ENTPs and ESTPs.
Yeah, so you're going to swap out at the 10-year-old position or the tertiary position that extroverted thinking for a different cognitive function. We talk about ENTPs and ESTPs. The cognitive function at that 10-year-old or tertiary position is technically called extroverted feeling. We've nicknamed it harmony. Harmony is interested in basically keeping harmony in social groups. They understand harmony users, when it's a strength, understand social dynamics really well. They understand how to get needs met. In fact, the needs of others is always on the radar of a harmony user, to say, there's needs going unmet. I want to meet these. I want to create harmony and get rid of discord in my world. And this at the 10-year-old level for ENTPs and ESTPs is going to be paired with the same two driver functions as the EFPs. So for ENTPs, this harmony process is going to be paired with extroverted intuition or exploration. And for ESTPs, this harmony process is going to be paired with extroverted sensing, or what we've nicknamed sensation. So this is the loop we're talking about, either a sensation harmony loop or an exploration harmony loop.
And harmony, especially as a 10-year-old, really is tapped into emotional connectedness between two people. That's really what it wants. It wants to be connected with other people. And so what ends up happening with all of these loops is it ends up being a desire to stay connected, even if that connection isn't particularly healthy for the ETP. And there is a need for other people to give it praise. Like, just like effectiveness is looking for, with EFPs, is looking for outward metrics. And praise could be a metric, but, money's good enough or social capital or whatever. For people who are using Harmony, it's really specifically about the people's feedback. Like, how are people actually seeing you and whether or not they like you or approve of you? And particularly at that 10-year-old level, approval becomes super important. So all of these loops are tied up in this concept. And again, it's an avoidance of whatever the Copilot process is. So for both ETPs, that Copilot process is introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. And accuracy, it wants truth. It doesn't care who likes it. It wants to have clean data. It wants to go into the mind and look for all of the corrupted pieces of information, all the beliefs, all the thoughts, all the paradigms, all the memes, whatever it has unconsciously integrated. It's constantly looking for and evaluating the usefulness, the truthfulness of that information. And so when an ETP is avoidant of that, when they're in a loop, they're specifically trying to get away from their own personal truth. Just like EFPs are getting away from their own personal self-evaluation, ETPs are getting away from their cognitive dissonance. So all of these loops are an endeavor to run away from a truth that is haunting you, and you can't get away from it. So let's talk about the loops. The first one, again, is that more explosive, hot burning, in the moment defensive stance. And it's going to be emotional because harmony or extroverted feeling is about expressing emotions. So what's interesting is that it can look one of two ways. It can either look truly explosive, like anger, and it can be attacking and criticizing and blame casting. It can be very aggressive and angry. Or it can be jokingly dismissive. It can use what it knows about harmony to just kind of act like that's not that big of a deal and whatever, and it makes fun of it and it derides it. It's very derisive, and it just acts like whoever would think that was important is an idiot. And then it looks to other people with this sort of joking manner. It looks to other people to approve of it by also laughing. So it almost uses a form of bullying in a way. So it can be either explosive anger or it can be bullying or joking derision. But of course, again, the point is to get away from whatever inner truth is haunting the ETP.
Usually this is going to show up a lot more personal toward people. So it's going to be, breaking connection with someone, creating discord, or like Antonia said, that joking piece, maybe even putting someone in at the expense of a joke and then getting other people around to buy in and laugh together at that person, because then it's bastardizing connection. You're able to make fun of somebody using that same process and then use it as a connection point with others. That bullying piece, that kind of that joking, that throwing someone under the bus humorously can be something that manifests it this way. So it's a little different than the extroverted thinking forcefulness. This is much more personal in a way.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is you mentioned that the anger piece creates discord, but actually, if you notice, when we're mad at somebody, that's when they bend over backwards to try to create harmony with us. And so it's not an attempt to create discord, it's an attempt to manufacture discord so that the other person behaves in a way to come make peace with you. Like they have to now do what you want them to do in order to not be in the doghouse with you anymore. So it's emotional manipulation in both cases, but it's a sharp emotional manipulation. So the second version of harmony as a loop is compulsive praise seeking. This is a strategy, again, the strategy you pull off the shelf to get what you want. And in this, it's more about this idea of status mongering. It's an attempt to get large groups of people to like you or to praise you. You can see ETPs that do this because they're almost always bragging about themselves and trying to get other people to jump on this bragging bandwagon. But as you get older, you notice that people don't like direct bragging as much. That's off-putting to them. So they'll figure out a bunch of different ways to get you to praise them in a more sort of sophisticated way. And again, the praise that they're seeking and the attempts to have people say that they're oh so funny or they're so good at whatever they do, or whatever is the compulsive praise seeking, is an attempt to separate themselves from their own personal evaluations, which is you're not all that. You're not doing as well as you could be doing. You probably actually are quite avoidant of your true competencies. And you might even be a little bit emotionally or psychologically lazy. In fact, you're probably being psychologically lazy since you're avoiding your Copilot of accuracy. And an attempt to run away from that, and anytime the outer world mirrors that to the person, they will they'll go into a place of attempting to find praise. I actually recently had this happen within the last day. So we've been uploading our podcasts onto YouTube. It's a new YouTube channel called Personality Hacker Podcasts. And we've been doing them in the order that we created the podcast, right? That's the order that we're doing them. So we did 2 type-based podcasts early on, and then we did a series of the other ones. And the first one we did was INFJ, and then a little later we did INFP, and then we did a series of all of the rest of the 14. So the only 2 type-based podcasts that are on the YouTube channel right now are INFJ and INFP, and the rest of them aren't there. And I've been kind of monitoring because I can't stop myself from getting outer world feedback. I have to read the comments. And most of them have actually been pretty good, especially for YouTube comments. I think they've actually improved in quality. But just yesterday, as of the time of this recording, somebody hated me so much on the INFP podcast that they had to make 2 separate comments talking about how annoying I am. They're like, Antonia is so annoying. And the first comment was like at a certain time, clearly they were listening to the podcast and they had to make the comment. And then 1 hour later, they had to make yet another comment about how annoying I am. And they're like, I'm an INFP and Joel is so articulate and he's so smart and everything he says is so amazing. And then Antonia starts talking and I almost have to turn the podcast off because it's so awful. And then an hour later, he's like, Antonia is so annoying. And I'm like, geez, all right, well, I guess I'll stop podcasting. Like everything just sort of starts shutting down inside me. And I start thinking, okay, well, I'll just stop creating podcasts then. As opposed to thinking, there's a lot of podcasts out there, buddy. You can go listen to them, go find your zone. I start taking it really personally, and my harmony process starts sort of shutting down and I get really upset. And this is me avoiding my Copilot process of self-evaluation, which says I'm on a mission. I got stuff I got to say. People can go find their zone. They don't have to listen to me, but here I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to keep doing it. And I could see myself getting into this loop of like I had to go find other positive comments. I went to testimonials. I went to the podcast testimonials. I went to other YouTube comments. I went to comments under our blog. Like I had to get as many positive comments as I possibly could inside me in order to offset this one person who's like, oh, she's so annoying. And I'm like, I know dudes find me annoying sometimes. I get that. I suspect that there is a little bit of this whole sort of like women shouldn't be know-it-alls thing going on, which is fine. I get it. I get why that can be disturbing and distracting. And also, it could just be that we don't gel. I mean, I would be surprised if an INFP wasn't into me, honestly, because I've always gotten along with like literally every INFP I've ever met. And also, that's one dude that's an INFP that doesn't like me. So it just shows that I can't rest into my belief systems about how, I'm an INFP whisperer or whatever. Regardless, I could see myself getting into a loop of wanting praise. I could see myself needing that strategy of needing praise in order to offset the negative feedback. And the only reason why I'm podcasting right now is because I let go of the need for praise, because honestly, it wasn't moving the needle. All the praise that I was reading and everywhere else, which was like, and when Antonia says stuff, it like really strikes me. Like none of that mattered. I had to get back into my accuracy, which said, I have a point. I have a purpose. I have to do this. Whether nobody listens, I got to keep going because this is just something I got to do. And I've got to be rooted in it. And I think if I hadn't done the work of developing my accuracy process, I think I probably would have been in a really bad loop. And I would have used the strategy of praise seeking and bragging. And I would have maybe made a comment in our personal personality hacker, intuitive awakening group in a very subtle way, creating a post to try to get as much positive feedback as possible. Like I almost did that. I almost went to our intuitive awakening group and made some sort of like subtle, comments or or post to try to get as much praise as possible. Like that was on my list of things potentially to do. And I chose not to do that. I went, no, I'm going to stick with my accuracy and I'm going to make it about that. But it's only because I've done a ton of work around this. So you could see how ETPs would get in a place where if they get negative feedback, their introverted thinking may not be at a point where it can handle it and slice through the bullshit anyway. And so then they go to the strategy of praise seeking.
I think the other strategy that can show up here too for ETPs is the bad feedback. You get that bad comment or bad feedback, and you're like, "Yep, I'm an asshole. I'm a jerk. I'm a mean person. Yep, and you own almost the negative feedback in a way, and then you start to play to that role in some ways. I see especially young ETPs doing this. Like in their early days, they might just embody that role of being the jerk, the asshole, whatever, and then kind of showing up and amplifying it in a way as a protection mechanism.
Yeah, it becomes part of their social identity. And actually, weirdly enough, people will give you praise for being an asshole. It's amazing. It is amazing that when you own being an asshole, a bunch of people think you're somehow developed.
Yeah.
Because you just don't care what society thinks. But really, you actually super care. You're just using that as your defense strategy. Okay, so again, we're spending way too much time on these because we're like, these are our loops. I have specific examples. But let's go to the third style of ETP loop, which is very similar to the extroverted thinking style of loop, which for extroverted thinking, it was outsourcing your self-esteem. And for EFPs, it's outsourcing your ideas and values to other people, your beliefs to other people. And that's why it's, again, these third styles of loops that are integrated into your life are so insidious because nobody can see it but you. You're the only person that knows what you truly believe. You're the only person who knows what you're truly thinking. And so if you're going along in the world, believing things, creating an entire life around something that your introverted thinking or accuracy process is like, I don't think so, man. Like, I think you might have some dissonance around this. And you're like, shut up, accuracy. And you beat it up. And your 10-year-old comes in and it's like, no, this is what we're going to do. That is an entire lifestyle of outsourcing your beliefs and mindset to other people to make those decisions for you. You could be in a career that isn't right for you. You could be in a religion or a paradigm that isn't right for you. You could basically be outsourcing your entire life to other people's opinions simply because you don't want to lose those relationships. And that is the low-grade version of this loop.
Okay, let's close out the EPs then, and let's start talking about the IJs. We're going to talk about the INFJ, ISFJ, INTJ, and ISTJs in the Myers-Briggs system. These are the last four of the types we have to talk about in the looping. And let's talk about the ITJs first. So INTJs and ISTJs. Both of these types are going to have the cognitive function, technically called introverted feeling, we've nicknamed it authenticity, at the 10-year-old or tertiary position. And for INTJs, that authenticity is going to be looping with a driver or dominant function of introverted intuition, we've nicknamed it perspectives. And for ISTJs, that introverted feeling or authenticity is going to be looping with introverted sensing. We've nicknamed that memory. Again,
the loop happens as an avoidance of the Copilot process or the auxiliary process. And in both these cases of ITJs, that Copilot or auxiliary process is extroverted thinking or what we call effectiveness. And the avoidant question for both of these types is, what is good enough? And just like all of us need to do some work of getting really good at dialing in our evaluations, and for those of us who use a judging function or a decision-making function as our Copilot, just like we talked about EPs, they're trying to avoid this more subjective question of, like what is my evaluative criteria about myself? Which feels, it kind of feels like it's murky territory, and they have to do a lot of work, regardless of whether or not they're using accuracy or authenticity. They have to do a lot of work to get really clear on that question for themselves. There can be an equal lack of clarity for IJs that are trying to determine what is good enough to the outside world, because sometimes we get mixed signals from the outside world. And if we're not really good at, maybe in the case of ITJs with effectiveness, at knowing what was good enough, right? Like we had the impact we wanted to have. It was positive. It worked well, but are we sure it worked well? Like, is it sustainable enough, or did I get the return I wanted? Or there can be a lot of questions around whether or not that was a truly dialed in, impact. Like that was what I wanted to go for. And so what will happen is, because they're introverts and they're used to using a process that is more inwardly focused and more subjectively turned as their driver, then they'll resort to or over-rely on their own subjective criteria for what good enough is. And in this case, that subjective criteria is, how did I feel about it? With authenticity or introverted feeling, it's like, well, how do I feel? So all of the loops that we're about to talk about are essentially, I won't use effectively because that's confusing, are essentially the ITJ consulting their inner calibration when they actually should be getting better at determining what an effective result was, like how to measure it in the outside world.
And it's also extroverted thinking. That effectiveness process is about getting into action in the outside world. And so when you're in this introverted process, the 10-year-old or INTJ or ISTJ, you're avoiding doing the thing that's going to get you the results, which is get into action, do something in the outer world. You can't just churn and feel about it all day. That will not create results necessarily. So how do these loops show up? There's 3 of those flavors we talked about.
So that initial hot burning, I'm in a moment, I feel like I'm cornered, right? I'm a scared animal, I'm cornered, so I'm going to get defensive. That first style of loop, which is the most obvious, again, to people on the outside for ITJs, is generally, it's an emotional position. It's introverted feeling. So they consult their emotions and they're consulting how they feel about them and evaluating it based on how they feel. And the defensive stance they usually take is pride. It's hurt, really, underneath it all. And oftentimes this manifests when they don't want to have to, like you just mentioned, Joel, they don't want to have to go do something. They don't want to have to ask themselves if the action they just took or the action they're about to take was the right one. It actually did, it passed. It was good. It was successful. And maybe it wasn't, or maybe they fear it won't be, right? There's a lot of fears around. All loops are usually predicated on some form of fear, or some fear of a lack of, like the person's self-worth will not measure up. And so if they fear a result, or if they didn't get the result they wanted to, or if the outside world is mirroring back to them something they should be handling and they're not, that's oftentimes when this shows up, is it's like, you got to go do something about this. You got to go make this happen. Then an ITJ will rest in on pride. And because the authenticity or introverted feeling process, when it's done very well, like when it's, a dominant or a driver process, especially, authenticity is great at reading intent. It's so good because it's always asking itself what its own intent is. And so it's always looking at this concept of intent. And so it gets pretty good usually, especially if somebody's well versed in using this process as a dominant or a driver or as a co-pilot. They get really good at reading people's intent. But as a 10-year-old, you're not so good at it. So a lot of times it's a projection of ill intent onto other people. It's like, well, you can't tell me to do that because you don't have good intent for me. You don't want what's best for me. I know you just want what's best for you. Or this concept of pride, like, you can't make me do anything. I know what's good for me. And it's resting into, you know yourself better than anybody else. So how could anybody else possibly give you feedback on what you should be doing? And so it ends up looking like a shutdown, right? Like the walls go up and the ITJ shuts down and they're impenetrable and you can't reach them. And they just stew in their own pride or their own projection of ill intent or whatever emotion that they've used as a buffer that protects them from the outer world feedback saying, maybe you should be doing something else. Maybe you're not succeeding here.
It can also be, again, that whole notion of noble distractions or noble pursuits. When this flares up, it doesn't have to necessarily show up as a bad pride. It doesn't have to show up as a defensive pride even. It could come out as something as like national pride or patriotism or religious pride or conviction of something that maybe the context you're in as an ITJ would be received well. It would be noble. Oh, well, you're convicted about your faith background or your religion. And so this pride that you're bringing out is a good pride, quote unquote, that's not necessarily called on in the outer world. It looks like it's a good manifestation of that, even though it's still an avoidance of getting into action in the outer world. And I just think that's something that you should watch for if you're an ITJ, because that is very insidious, because if that comes up, you're not going to get necessarily called on it. And you're probably not even going to notice it yourself because it's a positive pride you're bringing up.
Some of these loops, you're right. Like most of the time, especially that first style of loop will be very obvious to the outside world as a bad thing and you shouldn't be doing it. But one of the challenges certain types have is that some of the loops are actually rewarded in the outside world. There's this concept of inner conviction and strength that people will ascribe to ITJs, that, they're just being, they're being strong when really they might just be being avoidant or lazy, but the world will reward them for something that appears to be something else. And that's why each person has to be so vigilant about their own loops. You can't use the outer world to tell you whether or not you're doing a good or bad thing when it comes to a loop. You've got to use your own sort of you gotta be in integrity with yourself. You have to be very honest about your self-evaluations when you're in a loop. Because if you're relying on other people to let you know whether or not you're doing the right thing, they're just looking at your behavior and how they're interpreting your behavior. You're the person who knows what's going on for you. And you're right, sometimes that loop can look that way. But I personally, maybe it's just because of my personality type, but every time I see an ITJ go to their fat, that first style of loop with their pride or with their, conviction and the walls go up, I always have to just roll my eyes and go, okay, well, I guess I'll be approaching you later at another time when you're no longer in this space. And so metal, right? Like that's just that stance of metal, and it's impenetrable. And so I think that first style of loop it usually shows up in a way that allows the ITJ to just do whatever they feel like it, really. And a lot of times this will show up in relationships because their effectiveness, Copilot, hasn't yet figured out how to use these, basically extroverted thinking or effectiveness is a tough one to navigate around relationships because people sometimes project ill intent on it. They don't really understand how it works when it comes to the INTJ or the ISTJ. And so there's a lot of finagling an ITJ has to do with making sure that the effectiveness process isn't just using or seeing people as resources, and seeing them as lovers and spouses and family members. All sorts of, really great relationships can actually be cultivated in the effectiveness process, but it just takes some time to negotiate and figure that out. And if they keep getting feedback from the outside world that they haven't figured it out yet, they can just go, well, screw that. I'm not even going to try anymore. Or it's everybody else's fault, not mine. And that's usually when this first style of loop shows up. And of course, as with everybody, you got to get back in that Copilot process and figure that thing out. So that's the first style. The second style, again, is a strategy. You pull it off the shelf and use it when you need to. And it's one of your go-to strategies. And for ITJs, this will oftentimes look like a feeling of, again, it's back to that feeling, the emotion. It's avoidance and a feeling of overwhelm. Once again, you're trying to figure out any way that you can avoid that Copilot. And effectiveness, almost kind of like sensation. Effectiveness is like, let's not overcomplicate this. Let's just make this happen. Let's set up a system. Let's get it running. And let's make it so that, the things in my life that I don't want to have to expel energy towards, I'll just set up a system that runs, and that system will allow, like if I put enough time and effort into that system being sustainable, then I won't have to pour a bunch of time and energy into it. But if an ITJ hasn't set that system up yet and they don't want to, then they'll get avoidant. And this is why sometimes ITJs can look lazy to people in the outside world. Most of the work they're doing is mental, actually. For ITJs, most of the work they're going to do is mental, thinking through these systems that they're about to set up and then implementing it. But if they never get to the point of implementation, if they only stay in conceptualizing or abstracting the system and thinking about what the system would look like, then they can get into a place where they don't feel like setting the system up. They just wish somebody else would do that for them. And then they'll become overwhelmed when the system isn't set up and they're getting a lot of bad feedback from the outside world that's like, hey, you got to do something. But they're like, no, I'll keep thinking about this system as opposed to actually setting it up. Then when they hit sort of this event horizon of not having gotten their life together, they'll get into a space of emotional overwhelm. And then they just don't do anything. And this is a lot of times what they'll call paralysis analysis. Or they get massively overwhelmed and then they can't do anything. And if you try to get them to do something, the ITJ will just dig in their heels and just be like, nope, sorry, I can't do it. They'll break covenants and contracts. They won't show up to things that they've already promised that they'll show up to. They won't show up to family members, right? They'll just be in an avoidant space. And this is a strategy because the strategy isn't, you can't do that all the time. So obviously they're not living here, but they will use this strategy when it serves them to not have to get into action when they've already hit what they feel is that event horizon.
I think that when you do start to live there, though, it shifts into that third, more long-term integrated lifestyle. And it's not, there is some avoidance there, but what it is, it turns into, if it's a long-term lifestyle strategy, it ends up becoming a perfectionistic framework. So it's no longer strategically avoiding or strategically saying, I'm not ready yet, I can't be pushed. It's more about, this has to be perfect. And so the time is spent in the introverted space, instead of avoiding getting to action, it's spent, again, that perfectionist viewpoint. You're perfecting. I just have to perfect it. Don't push me. I'm perfecting this. Once it's perfected, I'm going to start moving in the outer world. Nothing is ever perfect in our world, though. It can't be perfect at the end of the day. And so nothing can ever be perfect. So you will always be, it's a way to be perpetually in that space indefinitely. And so it's a very long-term strategy that ends up becoming over time.
Yeah, again, I think ITJs are smart enough to know when they can fool other people. And perfectionism is a great one because, again, we talk about those noble distractions. People are like, yeah, you just want to get it right. But perfectionism is, and again, I use the word insidious. All of these third styles of loops are super insidious.
Well, because you're fooling yourself, really.
That's exactly it. And so this idea of the perfectionism, no, it has to be perfect, that can really mess with an INTJ. And again, the reason why is because they don't want to have to rely on the what the outer world is telling them of whether or not they passed or failed. They don't want to use those outer world metrics because they're unsure of what good enough is because they haven't developed their ability to read that as well yet. And so they want to go to that subjective criteria, which is you just can't get perfect. It's an idealization. And introverted feeling or authenticity tends to be idealistic to begin with. And so they're relying on this idealized concept of themselves. And then unfortunately, time doesn't wait for you. And the outer world metric of time, which the effectiveness process would be tapped into, effectiveness would be watching time go by and recognizing that the resource of time is limited and that it has to be capitalized on. But authenticity is not really tapped into that. It's just trying to figure out how it feels about it. And so for an ITJ to get into that perpetual perfectionistic loop means that extraordinary amounts of time are wasted in the desire to be an idealized version of oneself.
I would say, as we're talking, I get the sense that we're a little harder on these judging functions when they're at the 10-year-old tertiary level. In last episode of the podcast, we're a little more free-form with some of the perceiving functions. And I think the reason that is the case is, again, the judging functions, the decision-making functions are where our should statements lie. It's where we decide what we're going to do in life. And so even though both are loops, you can get a loop, obviously, if you have a perceiving function here at the 10-year-old or tertiary level, these judging functions at the 10-year-old level they can really be a difficult thing to shake loose because that's how we make our decisions. And when we get used to making decisions this way, this loop can be very difficult to break. And so we spent some time here, and it almost sounds like we're casting it more in a negative light, but I think we're really trying to dig into some of the challenges that are inherent to having a judging function stuck at the 10-year-old or tertiary level.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our last two types. So now we're going to swap out at the 10-year-old or tertiary level, we're going to swap out introverted feeling or authenticity for introverted thinking or accuracy. So accuracy is used as a strength by ETPs and ITPs. This is the INFJ or ISFJ type using accuracy or introverted thinking at the 10-year-old or tertiary level. It's going to be looped with ISFJs with introverted sensing or memory, and it's going to be looped with INFJs with introverted intuition or perspectives.
So the avoidance is the Copilot, which for both IFJ types is extroverted feeling or what we call harmony, which is about connectedness, emotional connectedness. It's about the understanding the social culture of any particular room or in greater and greater awareness and understanding of entire globes. And it's very much about emotional expression. So an IFJ that is attempting to avoid that will go to its polarity opposite of introverted thinking or accuracy, which, as we mentioned before when we talked about the ETPs, is about intellectual fidelity. It's about making sure that you are in integrity with yourself and that you are removing bad data. But at a 10-year-old level, it's a lot less about being truly self-aware around your data, and it's more about data collection and in some ways being right. And so with all of the loops, what's going to happen is there's an avoidance of the emotional interplay between the person and others, and instead resting into a more data-oriented place, a more cold, sort of emotionally distant place of the world of information and data. So the first style of loop, and again, this is the intense, in the moment, hot burning style, it's actually the opposite of hot burning. It's cold burning. It's criticism. And this in particular happens when an IFJ is emotionally overwhelmed by other people. When other people's emotions feel like too much, when they feel like they're getting too much emotional burden from the outside world, or they're dealing with conflict and they haven't built enough sophistication in that Copilot of harmony to be able to get through conflict to harmony, because that's really what harmony at its best doesn't avoid conflict. It works through it and it goes from discord to harmony. It doesn't just simply synthesize harmony or avoid discord. It actually creates harmony. That's what it does. It writes it. It doesn't just read it. But if an IFJ hasn't done the work to develop that skill of getting through the discord to harmony and to be able to build that muscle up, in a moment where the discord or the conflict overwhelms them, or just other people's icky emotions overwhelm them, they go to a place of coldness, that data-centric, emotionally disconnected, I'm just seeing the information in front of me and using it, and that's when their walls come up. Just like an ITJ will have walls of authenticity, an IFJ has walls of accuracy. It hides behind information. It uses information to its advantage to be able to create like a hand that stops the emotion from coming at it. And this would not be a bad strategy if it didn't also come with judgment. Being able to find your own emotional fortress is a positive thing. Being able to create good, strong boundaries around what you'll allow people to, do to you or make you feel is a healthy thing. But in this case, it's not about boundaries. It's simply about removal. It's about avoidance. And so it always comes with criticism and judgment to others. It's like, you're a bad person and I don't have to care about you because you're bad and I'm just going to stay away from you. And so it's instead of a hot burn, it's a cold burn, and it comes up fast. And sometimes people will call this like a door slam situation, but really it's just a complete and total removal of the other person from the IFJ's emotional field. So the second kind of loop is, again, the strategy, which is a pull off the shelf strategy. And this is not something that's going to be as obvious to the outside world. The second style isn't as obvious, but this is kind of a similar thing to the first style, which of course is more criticism or judgment. This actually goes towards research and righteousness. Now, research is a place that IFJs can find themselves in when they're perpetually researching more information. There's a kind of a scientific side to both IFJ types, which is that they like a lot of information and data about the things they're interested in, which is actually a good thing. That's one of the ways that their accuracy process supports them. But if they find themselves to be overwhelmed by the world of relationships, right, when there's too much conflict out there and they just don't know how to move the needle, they'll end up using the strategy of hiding themselves away in books or in DIY magazines or in whatever it is that they find personally interesting in some sort of scientific field or tech. And they'll cloister themselves off from the rest of the world and just stay in the world of research. And alternatively, especially in the modern political climate, this can actually look like righteousness. Like, there's too much conflict in the outside world. Nobody else is doing things right. Everybody else is doing them wrong. And it's bad. And the way that all these systems are set up are bad. So I'm going to continue to get more information about how things should be done right, and then I'm going to be righteous about it. And I'm going to project this righteousness onto the world, which is actually not a way to create true harmony. It's not actually changing or solving anything. It's just cloaking oneself in righteousness. And so that's the second style of strategy, especially when the world becomes overwhelming. And the third style of loop, and again, low grade, subterranean, integrated into your life, is almost identical. In fact, it's almost identical to the ITJ, which is perfectionism. Now, perfectionism looks a little different when the perfectionism is coming up with authenticity, like it does for an ITJ, which is an idealized version of the self, right? This idealized version of what a person could be. That's how ITJs are going towards perfectionism. With IFJs, the perfectionism is actually more of a technical perfectionism. It's this, one of my favorite examples of this, and it can be sort of extrapolated into all sorts of situations or circumstances, is the ISFJ that puts plastic on their couch, right? Because the idea is to make sure that they have a pristine home that everybody, when they come in, will find they'll find without exception, they'll find amazing and beautiful and perfect. And in that way, the ISFJ, or even an INFJ in this case, I've known INFJs to do the same thing, put plastic on their couches. The rationalization is that I want it to be perfect for all of my guests. But the problem is that that's not actually creating true harmony, because then all guests feel like they have to walk on eggshells in your house. They can't get anything dirty. A far more truly comfortable environment would be one that doesn't have plastic on it, where there's a couple spills and it's fine. It's not that big of a deal, and we'll just handle them. But it actually enforces a form of sort of this relationship that always has this perfectionistic plastic over the relationship itself. Like everything has to be perfect and everybody has to be perfect in it. And it creates a lot of discomfort, which harmony is really good at creating warm, inviting environments. But accuracy is not at the 10-year-old level. It creates a very, not hostile environment. It creates a very sort of like plasticky sheen environment. And if you take that same concept of putting plastic on the couches and then just now extrapolate it to all areas of your life where everything has to be perfect, otherwise it's unacceptable, it actually is a way to unintentionally force people out of your life. You will find yourself to be lonelier and lonelier, and people won't know how to engage with you because you require such a high, what's the word? Like the engagement must be only on this particular level. Like it creates this synthesized form of relationship, and nobody can actually just kind of be themselves. And that's the more low grade perfectionistic streak that IFJs can have. And they'll find themselves to be lonelier and lonelier over time because they're not actually creating true harmonious relationships.
So I want to give an example of how this might look or show up in real life. As an example, a story, in college, I was at a professor's house. He and his wife had become kind of mentors for me and some of the other college kids at the college I was going to. We went over to their house. Usually every couple weeks, we'd go over on a Sunday afternoon to have a big dinner, like several like tens of college, like 20 college kids or something, right? So we're over there, and being the type of person I am, I'm an acts of service type person. So I got into action trying to help around the house. And it was totally cool if you helped, in the serving of the food or cleaning up the table. But I noticed that the floor was a little dirty in this woman's house. And she was, I would say, probably an ISFJ looking back. And I remember picking up a broom and just taking initiative and started sweeping the floor in the kitchen. Everybody else was cleaning up other stuff. I started sweeping the floor. And I remember her looking at me and getting offended that I was sweeping her floor. And I was confused why this was the case. When everyone else is helping clean up the table, put the food away, do the dishes, why was she upset that I was pitching in and sweeping the floor? Well, this was something that she had built some ego around in her tertiary, her introverted thinking or accuracy process of having a really clean, harmonious house. And I remember that perfectionistic, basically she was taking the message by me cleaning her floor that I was saying to her, you don't have a clean house, you don't have a perfect house, because this is something outside of this event that's happening right now. This is something on a regular basis you must have dirty, which is your floor. Even though it was resulting from the event, she ended up having more of a response to me that was negative and feeling like I was being critical of her house just by taking an action. So you see that this could be very nuanced in its presentation. I wasn't actually being critical. There was no communication there. It was an action I was taking that she was then turning back on herself and her environment of perfectionism, saying, oh, I must not be perfect. I must not be good enough. I don't keep house well. And I have a deficiency here because this guy here is picking up a broom to sweep my floor. It was a very interesting experience for me because I was like, I put the broom down. I was like, man, I did not mean to be offensive here at all. But this is just an example of maybe how this could show up. And when you start seeing the real examples of this, maybe in your life or other people around you, you're like, oh, okay, this is very insidious. Sneaks up on you in different ways that you may not be able to really spot unless you're looking for them and paying attention.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of, unfortunately, with the defensive stances and these 10-year-old processes, we can't help but project outward how we're feeling about ourselves. And so this often ends up manifesting for IFJs as a critical spirit to other people too. It's not only a self-perfectionistic streak, it's also easily triggered by other people and what they're doing that the IFJ doesn't think that person should be doing, or thinking something they shouldn't be thinking. And so then they end up being unintentionally critical of others. And so a low-grade loop, like a low-grade integrated lifestyle loop for an IFJ, will look like criticism. It'll be a critical spirit towards other people. And that's one of the ways that you can know that you're living there. And again, other people have a hard time calling you on, no matter what your type is, other people have a hard time spotting this third style of loop because, it just kind of feels like, well, that's just how that person is. And so you're going to have to be really radically honest with yourself, regardless of your type. Closing out these IJs, let's just look at all 16 types. You're the only person that's going to know if you're living in a loop, because other people may even praise you for being in that space because you're intentionally creating. You've intentionally created a strategy on a lifestyle level where other people will praise you. Like that's the crazy thing about that third style of loop.
That's why you've done it so long.
Exactly. That's why you're able to get away with it. So looking back at all of these styles of loops, and it probably did seem like we were a little harsher on the 4 judging functions, probably because we live in that space ourselves. And so we're like, this is our loop too, and it's bad and we shouldn't be doing it. But really, it doesn't matter what function falls in your 10-year-old cognitive function position. It doesn't really matter which one it is. It's not going to help you. It's not going to serve you. We're going to do it. We can't stop ourselves from doing it. We're all going to be in a loop at some time. We're either going to be in an incidental in the moment loop, we're going to have figured out a strategy with our loop, or we might actually be living in our loops. And I mean, I've been there. I lived for decades in my loop of handing over my beliefs and thoughts to other people. And so we all do it. But regardless of whether or not we're doing it, the important thing is first, be patient with yourself. Have some mercy on who you are and how you operate. Understand how your mind is going to manifest with these loops and just get really good at spotting them. And the first step is self-awareness. So have some patience with yourself. Get good at spotting them. And then get into your Copilot, because your Copilot is the thing that will pull you out of a loop. Get really good at really, really figure out what the point of your Copilot is for you. I think that's what it is like get really good at understanding the function it serves in your life. Get super good at really recognizing how great of a servant it is for you. If you look at the car model, it's the one that's got the map in their hand, right? The navigator, it's not the driver that holds the map. It's the navigator that holds the map. The Copilot is the one who's giving instructions and helping the driver figure out what to do with, where to go and where to drive and how to avoid traffic and how to get around that accident. And, oh, did you see that light? And, oh, stop because there's brake lights in front of you. Like that Copilot is so important for the driver. So really, really get good at recognizing its purpose in your life and how it shows up for you. And don't let your 10-year-olds seduce you into getting into an echo chamber with it. Get super good at focusing on that Copilot and making it the best function you can make it.
That was a good wrap up. That was fantastic. I couldn't add more to that. So I think what Antonia just said, I want to echo. We want to hear from you, though. We want to hear what your story is. Has this resonated with you as an EP or an IJ if you're listening? Have you seen yourself show up in some of these loops we talked about today? What are the ways you've gotten out of it? What are the ways that you've seen it show up that you haven't been able to get out of it? You're still struggling with it maybe. Maybe you have a story to tell us about a looping situation you've gotten into. We'd love to hear from you. We want your voice to be involved here at Personality Hacker. One of the best places to give feedback about this particular episode is over at personalityhacker.com. You can find this episode and then leave a comment, ask a question, tell your story, engage with the community. Underneath the podcast, we'd love to have your voice represented. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are desiring to be supportive of Personality Hacker, we just want to remind you, you've got a lot of really great premium content over at the website. So if that's interesting to you, go check it out.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.